very, yeah, it really is genuinely open, isn't it? It really is, it's very hard to say what's going to happen here. It's sort of, it is on the brink, I think.
Can I ask one other question? We've heard some reports that Obama may be going back into negotiating sessions now, and Obama himself did not say that during his speech. He probably wouldn't because he wouldn't want to raise any expectations, but have you heard anything?
We have heard that he has cleared his schedule for today, and one can only assume that is because he's going to go into negotiations or try to figure out how we can best utilize, how the government can utilize President Obama to negotiate and push on various points.
I don't know, in the draft document you've seen, one of the things that's sort of bedeviled this conference has been the developing countries feeling that they're being sort of outmaneuvered through the Danish chair and leaked papers or whatever it is, and every time there's a consultation they seem not to have, or they feel they don't have enough representation. Is that true of this group of the 26? Have you heard anything that maybe they feel it was a bit weighted against them?
I think I've seen a list, and the list of countries that are participating end up being many of the countries that were contacted by either the United States or the European Union. So if I were a developing country that was not a part of those discussions, I'd be really concerned about who actually is representing my interests in that discussion. And in fact, the draft political text, you have to say there's really nobody in those rooms that are representing the needs of the developing world.
Oh, really? Not just of the poorest countries, but of the developing world? Or do you mean, say, the small island states in Africa?
There's no mention of 1.5 degrees. There's only $100 billion in financing in the draft agreement that we saw. There's no emission reduction targets for the developed world right now. And, it says we will try to achieve 2 degrees Celsius. So, if you look at that agreement, it's essentially what the United States and potentially the EU came into this process wanting, more of the United States than Canada. It's kind of disheartening to see that none of the developing countries' demands are really in this document.
That would be a really quite extraordinary outcome after all this time of negotiating. I mean, one of the things that struck me was in this session when the leaders made their declarations, speeches, I don't know what they're called, their interventions in UN language, was that for instance, Lula's speech, which was very warmly greeted and seemed heartfelt. Who knows what people's motivations really are, but it was a good speech. And he was restating really strongly this point that developing countries have a priority for development. They've got to develop. People, he was talking about when he got into office, one of his first things in mind was, I want to give Brazilians breakfast, lunch and dinner. And how come we're still, this is such a basic tenet of these negotiations, that the developing countries have a right to develop. That's why the industrialized countries were asked to reduce their emissions first and then developing. This is like step one, and yet he's having to say it again years and years on. That's what's so disheartening and worrying, I think, at this point.
Well, I think India is another example. There's, 400 million people in India that have no power whatsoever, and so we're actually going to ask India to start regulating and start taking these mitigation targets when they can't even supply electricity to a significant portion of their population. I mean, these are the discussions that need to happen. From the United States point of view, they're not happening at any reasonable level.
Jeffrey.
Let me ask you what Friends of the Earth US is going to do next after this, because Friends of the Earth US is a very well-known, high-profile campaigning activist organization, many thousands of members all around the world, in the US, many in the United States. We spoke to Bill McKibben of 350.org earlier this week and talked a little bit about direct action protests, civil disobedience, things like that. We now seem to be in a situation where the governments, if things come out the way we expect they're looking now, the governments are not going to step up and take the action needed to hold to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yet we have polls in the United States and other countries where people overwhelmingly say they want their government to take action on climate change. Now, you're a group that has the potential to activate a lot of people around that issue. Do you see civil disobedience? Is that what needs to come now because the government is not respecting what its people want it to do?
I think we have to, we, the civil society collectively, need to reevaluate what we're doing after this conference, because we, from civil society point of view, I don't think we've done enough. We, throughout the world are giving our leaders the ability to get out of this, I think, unscathed. And so it's going to require a rethinking from Friends of the Earth of the United States and I think the rest of the environmental NGO community around the world to actually figure out what we need to do to move our governments to be more aggressive. Whether it's civil disobedience, whether it is more hardcore advocacy in the capitals, calling on the public to actually get engaged on these issues. These are all things that we have to reconsider. And in Friends of the Earth International, here at the COP conference, we were participating in protests demanding more to our world leaders. I mean, Wednesday we got thrown out of this complex because of the messaging that we were having that was too strong and too harsh. So I think Friends of the Earth is prepared to do this going into the future. But I think it requires that we kind of take a step back and kind of rethink about where we're at, what we're doing, because it's obviously not enough.
And what can you explain what's happening now? Okay, the leaders make their speeches, they go away, they polish up their draft declaration as best they can. Not much shine on it at the moment, but maybe they can put in a phrase or two. At the same, and when you walk through the hall, lots of delegates are not even in the sort of, as it were, the plenary session anymore. They're gathered round monitors out in the hall watching and lined up in chairs. It's quite an amusing spectacle. But presumably negotiations are still continuing on all these little specific details of other issues here, of adaptation and forests and transfer of technology. That is going on, is it, as far as you know? It hasn't all stopped while we wait for the big declaration.
I'm not aware of negotiations, at least official UN negotiations are going on right now. There may be some behind the doors discussions. I think that you saw almost a wait-and-see attitude because you saw Brazil and China and Venezuela, United States, Russia. Like this morning was the heavy hitters of the political discussion on here in the UN, given their speeches. So I think everybody kind of was waiting with bated breath to see what these leaders and what these countries that have the power to really dictate the result of this conference, what they're going to say. And so we'll see. We'll see what's going to happen in the future.
Okay, just a little bit more. Are you checking the Twitters, Jeffrey? My colleague's just having a look at emails and Twitter, I think. But I don't know what's coming up. Can I ask you one question about Friends of the Earth? It's a rather unusual organisation in some ways, and you've got national Friends of the Earth all over the place. Presumably their priorities in different countries, and the priorities of the people who support you are different. Is that a problem? How do you get to the point where you come here and people think it's Friends of the Earth? They don't think, here's Friends of the Earth, the US. They want a clear line. So how do you get a clear line when the priorities of Friends of the Earth in Malaysia may be different from Friends of the Earth in the US?
Well, Friends of the Earth International and the Friends of the Earth groups, we're a bottom-up organization. So each country group, Friends of the Earth United States or Friends of the Earth Malaysia, we are independent organizations that run our own campaigns, hire our own staff, do our work within country. When we act here in the United Nations or these international negotiations, we come underneath the umbrella of Friends of the Earth International. And Friends of the Earth International has, we have agreed upon positions, agreed upon advocacy tools, agreed upon messaging. And so when we come to these international negotiations, we essentially, the 77 countries that we represent, we come with one voice. And then we try to distill that one voice back down to the individual countries that we work on a daily basis.
Friends of the Earth can do it. I don't see why these delegates can't, but that's